The fog of Bordeaux was not the gentle, rolling mist of English mornings. It was thick and wet, a cold shroud that smelled of damp stone and the deep, silent river. It clung to the wrought iron balconies and muffled the already minimal sound of traffic on the Quai de Chartrons. It was the perfect stage for the place I had found, the perfect camouflage for a building that didn't belong. I was Elias Vance, a 21-year-old art student from Portland, chasing the romantic poverty of a European education. My pursuit of aesthetic enlightenment, however, had led me straight into the crushing reality of tuition fees and rent that seemed to multiply in the darkness. My parents, stretched thin and exhausted, couldn't send another wire. I needed money that didn't require me to charm tourists or pretend to appreciate bad abstract expressionism. My fascination with the grotesque, the endless loop of true crime podcasts, and the strange, unsettling forums I frequented was what led me to the ad. It was taped inside the window of a dusty tobacco down a nameless side street. Night shift available. Inquire at the Nightside Depot. Curiosity rewarded. The name alone should have been a red flag, but a cold, persistent hunger for the strange always superseded common sense in my mind. I called the number listed, a burner phone that rang once and was answered immediately. The voice on the other end, deep, utterly devoid of inflection, and vaguely female, simply asked, "You're available from midnight to dawn?" I said yes. "You start tonight. Bring nothing but yourself." That was it. No interview, no ID check, no tax forms. The non-existence of the hiring process felt like an irresistible pull, a confirmation that this was exactly the kind of story I loved to read. Except now I was the protagonist. The Nightside Depot was exactly as it sounded, a warehouse, but small and squat, nestled between a shuttered bakery and a wall covered in ivy. It had no proper signage, only the faint, rust-colored outline of where letters might once have been. The windows were small, high, and coated in decades of grime, revealing nothing of the interior. I arrived precisely at midnight, the fog so dense now it felt like wet cotton in my lungs. As I pushed open the single metal door, a high, electrical whine greeted me. The air inside was stale, cold, and impossibly dry, like breathing in the dust from an ancient film reel. The store was not a supermarket. It was a logistics graveyard. The aisles were narrow and overwhelmingly long, stretching back into darkness that the flickering, pale yellow fluorescent lights could not fully penetrate. The shelves were packed with unlabeled, monochromatic boxes, inventory for a supply chain that seemed to exist outside of any known commerce. Behind a high, steel counter stood my manager, Margot. She was small, with tight, dark hair pulled back severely, and she wore a shapeless gray uniform. Her face was a study in profound exhaustion, framed by permanent shadows under eyes that were the dull, matte color of slate. She didn't look up from a tattered magazine. "Vance," she stated, not a question. "Elias." "Yes." She pushed a set of heavy, tarnished keys across the counter. They made a soft, dead sound on the laminate. "You run the perimeter. You log deliveries. You do not touch the inventory unless instructed." Her voice was a low, sandpapery murmur. She never made eye contact. "The break room is behind the loading dock. Your uniform is there. Your instructions are there." She glanced up only once, her eyes meeting mine, and I felt a sudden, profound spike of cold. "Follow the instructions, Elias. You might hate the money, but you'll hate what happens if you break the rules more." With that, she took a vacuum flask from beneath the counter, drained it, and walked out the door without a goodbye, leaving me alone with the buzzing lights and the silent, packed shelves. The Nightside Depot was suffocatingly quiet. Every echo of my own footsteps, every rustle of my cheap jacket, felt like a transgression. I made my way past the loading area, a dark, yawning space that smelled of rust and something acrid, like burnt chemicals, to the break room. It was a small, windowless concrete box. A steel table was bolted to the floor, flanked by two chairs that looked older than I was. On the table, neatly folded, was a uniform identical to Margot's. Beside it lay my instructions, not on a cheap VHS, but in a small, leather-bound journal. The leather was dark, almost black, and felt clammy to the touch. It had no title, but the pages were filled with densely packed script in a shocking, visceral red ink that was definitely not fountain pen. It looked like clotted blood. I opened it, the brittle pages protesting with a faint, dry crackle. This wasn't a manual, it was a testament, a survival guide left by a previous, terrified soul. At the top of the first intact page, scrawled fiercely, were the words, "The Nocturne Clauses." I settled onto one of the metal chairs, the cold seeping through my trousers, and began to read, every word sinking into my consciousness like a stone into black water. The Nocturne Clauses. Silence before the apologists. Observation. They are children, 2, perhaps 3, and they will appear outside the front glass between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Their clothes are wrong, linen and wool, medieval. They are small, but their presence is vast. The mark. Their eyes are not black, but a deep, polished agate, a mineral stone, solid and brown, without pupil or white. They absorb the light. Action required. They will not beg to enter. They will only whisper. They will place their small, dirty hands against the glass and murmur, ceaselessly, repetitive phrases of abject apology. Forgive me, for I did not see it burn. Forgive us, for we held the match. Forgive us, for we wanted to be found. Compliance. You must not acknowledge their presence. You must not look at their eyes for longer than 3 seconds. And most crucially, you must not accept their apology. Do not nod. Do not speak. Do not react. To accept their words is to invite them to complete their penance inside the walls. They are trapped in a loop, and your silence is the only circuit breaker. 2. The Lost Found of Aisle Zero. The hallway. The Nightside Depot has only 7 structural aisles. Aisle Zero does not exist in 3 dimensions. It corresponds to the location of the old mortuary's primary embalming slab, the central altar. The announcement. If the intercom, that horrible, tinny box, cries out, "A lost found on aisle 0. Repositioning required," then you are in immediate, terminal danger. Action required. You must immediately drop to the floor. You must use the nearest shelf or counter as a shield. Lock your focus entirely on the floor. Count the tiles, count your own breaths, and, if possible, cover your eyes. The lost found are what was left behind, the fragments of flesh and memory. They are desperate to be made whole. If you look at them while they are repositioning, they will assume your form is the missing piece. Compliance. You must remain hidden until the buzzing silence returns. Do not investigate. Do not seek the sound. 3. Do not admire the beauty. The watcher. He stands in the dark, near the gaping mouth of the loading dock, or sometimes near the entrance to the break room. He is impossibly tall, unnaturally slender, and dressed in a perfectly tailored, matte black suit that seems to drink the light. The mark. He has no features. His head is an egg of polished bone, a complete and flawless erasure of identity. He is the watcher, the entity that was summoned, not created. Action required. You must pass him frequently. You must acknowledge his existence to ensure he knows you are following the rules. But you must never look at him for longer than a fleeting, dismissive glance. You must never stare, examine, or study his form. Compliance. His power is drawn from observation. He is a statue that moves only when the focus is elsewhere. Your admiration is his breath. Treat him like a nuisance, not an idol. He waits for the one soul curious enough to truly see him. 4. Serve the decaying man. The client. Around 4 a.m., a customer will appear. He is a man in outline, but his skin is utterly wrong. It is thin and translucent, like old, wet parchment stretched over bone. It moves, it ripples, it slides, giving the impression of constant internal decay. Action required. He will slide a single, tarnished French franc across the counter. He will ask, in a voice like dried leaves rattling, for a specific, unlabeled pack of cigarettes kept under the register. You must retrieve it and place it on the counter. Compliance. Do not speak. Do not react to the stench of sour milk and formaldehyde that precedes him. You must not touch his hand when he takes the pack. He cannot fully interact with the material world. Only the item of transaction can be touched. He will take the pack and disappear. The transaction is an appeasement. He is kept placid by a tiny, destructive act of commerce. V. The Proprietor's Nocturne Plate. The ritual, the most critical rule. Before Margot or the dawn light appears, you must prepare the Proprietor's Plate. This is not an offering. It is a toll. The ingredients, a small, chipped ceramic plate, must be sourced from the back cabinet. Upon it, place exactly 3 items: a small slice of raw, unprocessed meat, beef or pork, if available, a single potato that has clearly begun to sprout and decay, and a glass of water that has been allowed to sit overnight. Action required. You must place the plate on the breakroom table. You must step back 3 paces, and you must whisper the phrase, "For the Proprietor," for the stillness. Then you must leave the room immediately. Compliance. The Proprietor is the original sacrifice, the keeper of the seal. He is what gives the rules their power. His consumption of the toll is what guarantees your safety until dawn. If you fail this, his hunger will be transferred to you, and no clause will protect you. I closed the journal, my hands shaking so hard the worn leather slipped against the metal table. This wasn't a story. This was an operating manual for a nightmare. The silence of the warehouse outside the break room suddenly felt vast, hostile, and actively listening. I looked at the uniform, then at the clock on the wall. 12:45 a.m. I had 5 hours until dawn. 5 hours to follow a series of insane, precise rules meant to appease the horrors lurking in the aisles of the Nightside Depot. I slipped into the gray uniform, pulled the lapel of my jacket high around my neck, and stepped out of the break room. The chilling reality of the Nocturne Clauses my only guide. My story had begun. The first 15 minutes after reading the Nocturne Clauses were the hardest. My mind, usually so eager to dissect a strange narrative, was now a useless, vibrating mess of fear and disbelief. I tried to rationalize it, a complex prank, an initiation ritual designed to weed out the weak. But the journal felt too heavy, too earnest, and the blood-red script looked too real. I forced myself into action. Margot had said I needed to run the perimeter, which was the only truly normal job description I had. I pulled out the small, dim flashlight from the counter drawer, a cheap beam that barely cut through the general gloom, and began my slow, deliberate circuit of the depot. The floor was dusty concrete, and the long, thin aisles stretched out like tunnels dug through solid earth, each one echoing with the high, frantic hum of the fluorescent fixtures. I started with aisle 1. The inventory was uniform and oppressive, stacks of identical, unlabeled cardboard boxes, sealed with industrial plastic wrap. They contained nothing I could identify, no brand logos, no product names, just a series of arcane numerical sequences stamped in black ink. The labels seemed less like codes and more like serial numbers for the forgotten things of the world. What were they selling? What was this a depot for? I didn't dare touch them to find out. As I walked, I counted, needing the rhythm of numbers to tether me to reality. Aisle 1, Aisle 2, Aisle 3. The air remained dry and cold, but as I passed into the deeper shadows, I noticed subtle shifts. Between Aisle 3 and Aisle 5, there was an expanse of blank, stained concrete wall. It wasn't plastered over. It was simply a void, a space where another aisle should have been, but was instead filled by solid architecture. I shined my light along its length. The wall was covered in faint, hairline fractures that resembled the deep, spreading, desiccated roots of a dead tree. This was the location of the infamous Aisle Zero, the mortuary's embalming slab, the central altar. I felt a visceral revulsion, imagining the weight of the bodies, the silence of the ritual, sinking into the foundation beneath my feet. I could almost hear the old, rusted drain gurgling. I hurried past, the journal's second clause, the lost found of Aisle Zero, vibrating in the back of my mind, a threat of dimensional rupture. I made sure to walk near the shelves of Aisle 5, giving the blank wall a wide, fearful berth. My patrol continued around to the loading dock. This was the most massive, most threatening space in the depot. The metal door to the outside was reinforced with iron bars, but it was half open to an inner docking area, which was itself swallowed by impenetrable blackness. The air here was different. It was heavier, thick with the smell of wet rust, and something sharper, cleaner, like lye or bleach, the residual stink of preservation. And then I saw him. The Watcher. He was standing precisely where the third clause had warned, near the gaping mouth of the loading dock. He was utterly motionless, his outline impossibly tall, stretching up until his head, the smooth, blank orb of bone, disappeared into the higher shadows of the ceiling. His suit was a pure, matte black, absorbing all available light, making him appear less like a man and more like a tear in the fabric of the building itself. He wasn't breathing. He wasn't waiting. He was simply being. I stopped breathing too. The flashlight beam, trained instinctively on him, revealed only the polished, featureless surface of his head. It was flawless. The absence of eyes, nose, or mouth was not horrifying in the way a gaping wound is. It was horrifying in its perfection, a statement of complete and utter erasure. You must not stare, examine, or study his form. My artistic inclination, the very curiosity that had brought me here, was a screaming liability. My brain wanted to trace the clean line of his shoulder, to understand the tailoring of his black suit, to fathom the physics of his unnaturally elongated limbs. I squeezed my eyes shut for a sharp, painful second, forcing the image out. I lowered my gaze immediately, fixing my eyes on the cracked concrete floor. I began to walk again, forcing my pace to be dismissive, almost careless, as if he were merely a poorly stacked pallet I had to navigate around. As I passed him, keeping a safe distance near aisle 7, I felt a shift in the air pressure, a cold, dry vacuum, as if the space beside him was being actively emptied of oxygen. I did not look. I did not move my head. I walked by the absence of identity, treating him, as the journal commanded, like a mere nuisance. His stillness was not peace, it was potential energy. When I reached the counter again, my shirt was stuck to my back, and my hands were shaking violently against the steel. It was 1:05 a.m. I needed an anchor. The break room, despite its sinister instructions, felt like the only shelter. I went back and sat at the steel table, pulling the proprietor's ritual ingredients out from the hidden cabinet. A chunk of refrigerated pork, a pallid, sprouting potato, and the stale glass of water. They were waiting, pre-portioned, almost lovingly arranged for the nightly toll. I left them on the small preparation shelf, knowing the ritual was still hours away, but needing the comfort of the supplies. My eyes fell on the locker beside the bolted table. It was slightly ajar. Curiosity, the trait that would likely be my undoing, twitched in my fingers. I pulled the locker door open. Inside, beneath a faded, stained gray uniform, not unlike mine, but older and torn, was another journal. This one was smaller, wrapped in a thin layer of protective plastic, and it had a date scrawled on the front, 1978. It was clearly Joe's. I pulled it out and opened it, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't the official manual. This was a personal log, a man's descent into terror. The handwriting was erratic, a desperate, collapsing script that often ran off the margins. The early entries detailed the depot's history, confirming what Margot had only alluded to. The building was never constructed, it emerged. October 1978. I spoke to the old woman at the bakery. She remembers the fire. Not fire, she said, but melting, like the sky was coming undone. They were inside. The ones that stayed. The cult. They were trying to call something across. They succeeded. November 1978. It's the architecture that traps us. The shelves are not shelves. They are bars. The aisles are not aisles. They are vectors. I drew aisle 0 today. It is a scar. It is the center of the trap. December 1978. I have been given the rules. I am the first. The proprietor is not a man, not a ghost. He is the anchor they created in the chaos, a massive weight to hold the building in place. I must feed him. If he moves, we all fall. The apologists are outside. They are so cold. The last entry in Joe's log was dated exactly 5 years before the current journal's earliest date. It ended simply, "I think I understand why the apologists apologize. It's because they're glad they brought it here. They're glad it burns. They want to finish the work." I slammed the small journal shut and pushed it back into the locker, breathing heavily. The apologists. The agate whisperers. The ones trapped outside. The sound came exactly at 1:17 a.m., tearing through the manufactured silence of the depot. A light, insistent tapping on the front glass. Tap, tap, tap. I walked slowly back to the counter, my uniform feeling suddenly like a thin sheet of paper. There they were, 2 of them, a boy and a girl, standing on the perimeter of the depot's small, fog-shrouded parking lot. They were small, no older than 7 or 8. The boy wore a rough tunic, and the girl a simple, faded dress. Their clothing was so jarringly out of time, so wrong against the backdrop of modern Bordeaux. Their faces were pale and still, devoid of the normal nervous energy of children. But it was their eyes that stopped my heart. They were exactly as described. Not voids, not pits, but solid, unblinking spheres of polished, dark agate. They were the color of rich, dead earth, absorbing every photon the external streetlights offered, giving them a terrifying, luminous depth. The girl lifted a small hand and pressed it flat against the cold glass. She didn't look scared or sad. She looked resolved, like a martyr at the end of a very long wait. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, a sound barely heard over the hum of the depot's lights, but it had a strange, resonant quality, as if the words were being spoken directly inside my skull. "Forgive us, for we held the match. Forgive me, for I did not see it burn. Forgive us, for we wanted to be found." The boy joined in, his voice a low, mechanical drone, weaving in and out of the girl's high, delicate murmur. The sound was ceaseless, a relentless, quiet tide of guilt and demand. I remembered the compliance instruction. You must not accept their apology. I stood at the register, my hands flat on the counter, and stared fixedly at a smear of dirt on the laminate. I did not look at them. I focused on the sound of my own shallow, frantic breathing. I was hyper-aware of the agate eyes, a dark, unblinking pressure, fixed on my face. The temptation to react was overwhelming. To look up and shake my head, to mouth the words, "It's okay," or simply to acknowledge their suffering. They were children, and they were whispering the most primal need for absolution. But the journal warned that acceptance was an invitation. I locked my jaw. I didn't move. I did not blink for nearly 30 seconds, forcing myself to hold the rigidity of a mannequin. The whispering continued, rising slightly in volume, tapping against the glass of my sanity. "Forgive us. Forgive us. Forgive us. Forgive us." The boy's hand slipped, leaving a streak of what looked like dark, damp earth on the glass. Then his voice changed, just for a moment, a sudden, piercing clarity in the drone, intimate and terrifying. "We just want to complete the penance, Elias. Let us in, and we can finally rest." He knew my name. The blood went cold in my veins. I wanted to run, to scream, to break the silence. But I held the line. I focused on the dull ache in my knees and the faint buzzing of the lights, allowing nothing else to penetrate. They stayed there, whispering, for exactly 42 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as the tapping began, it stopped. The children turned in perfect synchronization, their agate eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, somewhere deep in the fog. They walked away, not hurried, but with the measured pace of those who know they will return. The silence that returned was deeper, heavier than before. I stood there, trembling, until the clock hit 2 a.m., the fear receding just enough to let me breathe. The first test was passed. I had not accepted their apology. I had not been found. But the night was long, and the watcher was still waiting by the loading dock. The aftermath of the agate whispers left me hollowed out, but strangely focused. Knowing they were real, knowing they knew my name, shifted the narrative from a horror story I was reading to a rule set I was desperately clinging to. I had passed the test of silence, but the night was only halfway through. It was 2:30 a.m. Time for another perimeter check, a task that now felt less like surveillance and more like traversing a consecrated but deeply corrupt temple. The quiet had returned, but it wasn't the dead silence of an empty building. It was a charged silence, the kind that precedes a violent storm. The fluorescent lights, which had maintained their sickly yellow hum, now began to stutter in a rhythmic pattern, not flickering off, but seeming to seize and release light, turning the aisles into a long, strobe-lit tunnel. I made my way down aisle 6. This aisle contained large, metallic drums and industrial containers, smelling faintly of old oil and something else, metallic and pungent, like pennies soaked in brine. As I passed them, I heard a sound that was impossible in a closed warehouse. The gentle, wet drip, drip, drip of water falling into a pool. I stopped. I checked the ceiling, but the pipes were dry and coated in dust. The sound seemed to be emanating from the boxes themselves. It was coming from the center of aisle 6. I lifted my light, shining it between the gaps in the inventory. The dripping noise was localized. I finally located the source, a single, unlabeled cardboard box near the floor. It was saturated, dark and spongy, and a slow stream of a viscous, reddish-brown fluid was oozing out from a seam, forming a small, congealed puddle on the concrete. It smelled like old iron and spoiled milk. I quickly checked the original journal. You do not touch the inventory unless instructed. This was not an instruction. This was a warning. The inventory was not just goods. It was a physical manifestation of the depot's function, storing the lost found, the fragments of the forgotten. What was dripping was not water. I forced myself to back away, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat. My patrol continued, but I felt a new sense of urgency. I had to reach the counter before 4 a.m., the time slot reserved for the decaying man. As I rounded the corner of aisle 7, heading back toward the dock, I saw the watcher again. He hadn't moved. He was still the perfectly tailored black void next to the massive, black inner dock. But as I walked past, forcing my eyes to stay on the floor, I registered a change that was only perceptible through peripheral vision, a phenomenon my eyes recorded but my consciousness refused to immediately process. The watcher was no longer just tall. He was longer. His black suit seemed to have flowed, the fabric now gathering slightly at the knees and the elbows, suggesting a subtle, impossible lengthening of the bone structure beneath. The space between his feet and his featureless head had gained another foot or two of void. The journal entry flashed in my mind. He is a statue that moves only when the focus is elsewhere. Your admiration is his breath. Had my brief, terrified glance earlier been enough to feed him? Did the act of walking past, the sheer terror of his proximity, count as observation? I didn't stop to find out. I walked faster, my dismissive pace turning into a ragged near run. I did not look back. I reached the main counter and collapsed onto the stool, the cold metal a sharp contrast to the panic-induced heat of my skin. It was 3:55 a.m., 5 minutes until the next clause. I scrambled beneath the counter, pulling out the specific, unlabeled pack of cigarettes, a faded, antique brand I'd never seen before, smelling faintly of wood smoke and cloves. I placed the pack next to the register, my hands hovering over the single tarnished French franc I had also been instructed to have ready. The air pressure dropped. It wasn't a draft. It was a physical sensation, like walking into a deeply pressurized room, or perhaps like walking out of one. The stench hit me first, not the sterile smell of the loading dock, but the profound, heartbreaking smell of decomposition and failure, of wet leather, dried blood, and souring human tissue. He appeared at the front door. He did not tap. He simply resolved into existence on the threshold. The decaying man. He wore clothes that were once expensive but now hung on him in soggy, discolored folds. But it was his skin, the wet parchment, that truly defied physics. It was translucent and glistening, pulled thin over the contours of his skull. I could see the faint yellow shape of bone beneath. His face was a mask of perpetual, agonizing regret, and his eyes, though human, were wet and unfocused, like those of a man perpetually underwater. He was not walking. He was sliding. His movements were not fluid, but rather a continuous, slow ripple of his own failing mass. He stopped directly opposite me, the counter serving as the boundary between our realities. He held out a hand, a thing of rippling, pale tissue and visible tendons, and with immense, visible effort, slid a single, tarnished French franc across the laminate. It was dark green with age and worn smooth. Then he spoke. His voice was not rattling leaves. It was worse. It was the sound of a vocal cord drying out mid-sentence, a continuous scraping, whispering sigh. The cloves. The final smoke. Give it to me. I forced my hand to move, sliding the unlabeled cigarette pack across the counter toward the franc. My heart was beating so hard I thought the sound would draw the watcher in from the back. I was terrified of violating the final compliance. You must not touch his hand when he takes the pack. The decaying man stared at the pack for a full minute, his wet eyes never leaving mine. It was a look of pure, agonizing need. It felt less like a customer waiting for a product and more like a starving wolf waiting for the bait to be placed just so. Finally, his hand moved. It didn't reach, it extended, the pale skin stretching like pulled taffy. As it hovered over the cigarette pack, I realized the full extent of the horror. His existence was barely tethered to this plane. The reason he couldn't touch the world was because the physical world was aggressively rejecting him. His fingertip made contact with the package. The moment of contact was heralded by a sound like frying meat. A faint plume of gray, sickly smoke rose from the pack where his finger touched it. The man gasped, a horrible, wheezing sound that rattled his whole, fragile frame. The franc coin, lying just inches away, suddenly went dull, losing all its tarnished sheen, turning into a piece of dull, lifeless lead. He snatched the pack, the gesture frantic and desperate, and then, without a word of thanks or a farewell, he began to turn. His departure was a terrible sight. He didn't walk toward the door. He simply dissolved, not quickly, but agonizingly slowly, starting from his feet, his form rippling and blurring until only the faint, terrible scent of decomposition lingered in the air. I slumped against the shelf behind me, gasping. I had done it. I had followed the rule. But the sheer reality of the encounter had fractured something in my mind. These were not ghosts. They were the byproducts of a ritual gone wrong, the prisoners of the depot's terrible, enduring architecture. I checked the clock for 10 a.m. Suddenly, the depot's intercom, which had been silent since Margot left, crackled violently. The static was so loud it sounded like ripping cloth, followed by a sudden, metallic, mechanical voice. Elias found on aisle 0. Repositioning required. My blood turned to ice. Clause 2. The terminal danger. And I was standing in the open, at the front counter, over 100 feet from aisle 0. I didn't hesitate. I dropped instantly, diving behind the thick steel counter. I curled into a ball, pressing my cheek against the cold, gritty floor. My mind screamed at me. Cover your eyes. Lock your focus. I jammed the heels of my hands into my eye sockets, forcing myself into absolute darkness. I began to count the floor tiles, an exercise in forced concentration. 1, 2, 3. Counting, counting, counting. The sound that followed was not a noise, but a distortion. It began as a low, deep frequency hum, a sound that shook the concrete more than it assaulted the ears. It felt like the entire building was being stretched and compressed simultaneously. The flickering fluorescent lights over the aisles began to scream, their high-pitched whine rising to an intolerable pitch. Then came the movement. It sounded like dragging, not the slow drag of heavy objects, but a rapid, wet, desperate sound. Something was being pulled along the concrete floor directly in the center of the store, the area corresponding to aisle 0. It sounded like 50 different parts, small bones, wet rags, broken porcelain, and something that thudded with the unmistakable, terrible weight of internal organs, all being scraped together, rushing toward one fixed point. The sound reached a crescendo near aisle 0, directly opposite where I was hiding. I heard a terrible crack, followed by a sucking, slurping sound, like mud being drawn through a straw. I felt a sudden, profound spike of cold, as if all the thermal energy had been ripped from the air. And then, just as quickly, it subsided. The fluorescent lights settled back into their routine, frantic hum. The dragging stopped. The air pressure returned to normal. I stayed hidden for another 2 full minutes, counting my breaths until the panic receded. Finally, I lifted my hands, my eyes aching from the pressure. I slowly rose, peering over the top of the counter. Everything looked the same. The aisles were long, silent, and oppressive. The boxes were neatly stacked. The air was still and dry. I risked a walk back toward the center of the depot, my flashlight beam shaking. I approached the blank, cracked concrete wall between aisle 3 and aisle 5, aisle 0. There was no crack in the wall, no visible disturbance. But on the floor, directly in front of the wall, there was a single, tiny, disturbing piece of evidence. A small, perfectly formed tooth. It wasn't human. It was a thin, elongated incisor, ivory white, and razor-sharp, like that of a small, predatory animal. It lay on the concrete, glinting under my light. I didn't touch it. I only looked. The lost found had been repositioned. The gap had opened and closed. But the tooth was proof that something had been searching for its missing piece, and I had nearly been found whole. I retreated to the counter, my mind numb with fear. It was 4:30 a.m. Only the final, most critical task remained. The proprietor's Nocturne plate. The adrenaline that had protected me during the repositioning of aisle 0 was now draining away, leaving behind a residue of shaking exhaustion. The small, razor-sharp tooth lay on the concrete, a silent threat that proved the rules were not just superstition. They were a fragile containment field. I retreated again to the break room, needing the momentary solace of four solid walls. The clock read 4:30 a.m., 90 minutes until dawn, but first, the proprietor's toll. I had the chipped ceramic plate, the raw pork slice, the sprouting potato, and the glass of stale water ready. Before performing the ritual, however, the intense curiosity that had been both my curse and my salvation demanded one more distraction. I returned to the abandoned locker and pulled out Joe's 1978 journal. I needed to understand why the proprietor's toll was so specific, why it consisted of decay, the potato, vitality, the meat, and stasis, the water. I flipped through the frantic, blood-stained pages until I found an entry near the end, scrawled with a terrible, forced clarity. May 1979. They are trying to find the missing connection. They call it the Nocturne. It is the ritual the cult performed before the fire, the attempt to bind an external force into a local anchor. The proprietor was the anchor. He was the one who consented to the final stage. The depot is the shell, the architecture built around a constant state of transition. The aisles are the arteries. The dock is the mouth. Aisle 0 is the wound. The toll is payment for his captivity. He has to eat the death, the potato, to remind him of what he became. He has to eat the life, the meat, to keep his strength to hold the line. The water is for the thirst of the watcher. It is a symbolic offering for the empty ones who guard the threshold. If he is fed, his gravity holds the walls closed. The realization was a punch to the gut. The proprietor wasn't just a force. He was a trapped entity, a sacrifice that bought my life every night. And the toll wasn't just for him. It was a tripartite offering to the forces that governed the depot. I closed the journal, placing it back gently. I understood now. Failure to feed the proprietor didn't just invite his hunger. It shattered the fragile, magical stasis of the building, unleashing the entire ecosystem of horrors. I retrieved the plate and walked back to the break room table, my every move careful and deliberate. The room felt colder than before. The faint smell of the decaying man's decomposition still lingered, a ghostly, sour odor. I placed the plate precisely in the center of the table. The raw pork looked glistening and red under the harsh light. The potato was an ugly, tumorous green-brown. The water was clouded. I stepped back exactly 3 paces, my heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm. The moment felt monumental, a tiny, insignificant gesture of fealty that held the fate of my survival. I whispered the mandatory words into the heavy, waiting silence. For the proprietor, for the stillness. I turned immediately to leave, compliance complete. But as I reached for the door handle, the air temperature in the room dropped again, plummeting to a level that burned my lungs. The light above the table, a single, caged bulb, went out with a soft pop, plunging the small room into darkness, illuminated only by the faint, filtered light from the warehouse proper. And then, I heard the sound from the table. It was not the sound of chewing. It was the sound of bone being slowly, wetly crushed, followed by a horrific, ragged inhale. It was deep, resonating, and utterly inhuman. It spoke of immense, ancient hunger. Then came the sound of porcelain scraping and a soft, insistent slurp. I froze with my hand inches from the door handle. The proprietor was consuming his toll, but something was wrong. The journal implied a rapid consumption, a desperate feeding. This was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. My eyes, adjusting to the darkness, darted toward the table. I saw nothing, but the shadows seemed to coagulate, growing thicker, more solid around the proprietor's plate. Then, through the darkness, a voice. It was not the loud, booming distortion of the intercom. It was a close, intimate, deeply resonant sound that seemed to be vibrating the very fluid inside my ears. It was a man's voice, perhaps, but impossibly deep, layered with the echoes of ancient stone. Elias, you are afraid of the wrong things. My blood turned to pure ice. It spoke to me. It knew my name. You follow the rules to protect yourself from the lost found. The voice continued, slow and heavy, the sounds of its feeding pausing. But the lost found are only the debris. I am the gravity. The chilling truth of Joe's journal echoed. He is the anchor they created in the chaos. The voice spoke again, closer now, a dreadful, thick whisper. You are looking for the way out of this architecture. You wish to return to your canvas, your art, your beautiful, fragile world. The proprietor had seen my desire, the deepest truth I held. Suddenly, the depot's main lights, the long humming fluorescent strips, all went out. Total, absolute darkness slammed into the break room, overwhelming the faint external light. A new sound emerged from the warehouse, a soft, perfectly tailored shush. The watcher was moving. I heard the sound of the black suit sliding over the concrete, the perfect, frictionless movement of the featureless monster. He was coming toward the break room. The proprietor's voice, now laced with a raw, desperate authority, boomed in the small room, cutting through the encroaching sound of the watcher. Elias, enough. You have paid the toll. Your payment is accepted. It is a thing of flesh, decay, and stasis. It is sufficient. The crushing sound of bone returned with a vengeance, accompanied by a sound like a wet sack dropping onto the floor. The proprietor had finished his meal. Then, there was a deafening crack from the warehouse, followed by a sound like rushing air, as if a massive, invisible object had just slammed into the exterior wall of the break room, directly opposite the door. The watcher had been intercepted. The proprietor, the sacrifice, the anchor, had used the energy from his feeding to enforce his jurisdiction. The raw meat and the decaying potato had given him the strength to hold the line. I heard the terrible, silent struggle in the main warehouse. The sound of fabric ripping against stone, the absence of any human cry. Just the terrible sound of two non-entities fighting for control of the space. After 30 seconds of this soundless, violent chaos, the fight suddenly ceased. A profound, lasting silence settled over the entire depot. The proprietor's voice, now exhausted and faint, returned one final time, a ragged, fading whisper from the table. Go. Return to the light. Do not ask for the exit again. I didn't need to be told twice. I lunged at the break room door, fumbling with the handle until it turned. I burst out into the absolute darkness of the loading dock area. I could see nothing. The light was gone. The depot was utterly, completely dark. I ran. I sprinted down the long, black aisles, guided only by the lingering scent of stale cardboard and the frantic, echoing memory of the building's layout. I was no longer running from the rules. I was running on the proprietor's command. I reached the front counter area, my lungs burning, my feet slapping against the concrete. I threw myself at the steel door, twisting the heavy key in the lock. It clicked open. The fog outside, previously so threatening, now looked like salvation. It was still thick, but there was a faint, bruised purple glow on the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. I burst out of the Nightside Depot and slammed the heavy door shut, locking it with the key. I didn't stop running until I had reached the far corner of the street. The cold, fresh air of Bordeaux clearing the sulphurous stench of the depot from my lungs. I leaned against a stone wall, panting, and watched the depot disappear into the fog. It was 5:50 a.m. The proprietor had held the line. I still had the keys. I walked away from the Nightside Depot, not on feet of a student seeking refuge, but on legs of hollowed-out concrete. The dawn, bruised and purple over the distant slate rooftops of Bordeaux, offered no real warmth. It only served to illuminate the grimy reality of the city street, a contrast so stark it felt unreal compared to the physics-defying blackness I had just escaped. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my tiny, miserable student room. The room smelled of turpentine and stale coffee, familiar scents that now felt flimsy, temporary. The horrors I had faced were monumental, but the world outside was still measured in rent, grades, and the price of a baguette. At 7 a.m., I found myself standing outside the depot again. The fog had thinned, and the building, stripped of the night's oppressive magic, looked exactly like what it was, a derelict, windowless warehouse. The sign was faded, the mortar cracked. It was a mundane shell over a bleeding wound in reality. Margot was waiting by the employee entrance, smoking a thin, acrid French cigarette. She was wearing the same perpetually tired expression, but there was a subtle, new appraisal in her eyes when she looked at me. Not curiosity, but a deep, sorrowful recognition. I walked up to her, my uniform shirt wrinkled and smelling faintly of decay and fear. I held out the heavy iron keys, the symbol of my bondage and my liberation. "I'm quitting," I said, the words feeling thin and meaningless against the backdrop of the proprietor's resonant whisper. Margot took a long, slow drag from her cigarette. The smoke drifted past her cold eyes. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. "You came out whole, Elias," she said, her voice a dry rasp, utterly devoid of sympathy or congratulations. "That is more than I expected. Many leave pieces behind." She flicked the cigarette, but into a puddle. "The money will be transferred to your account by noon. Do not come back here, even in daylight. You have seen the architecture, the vectors, the gravity. You know the price of curiosity." "The proprietor," I started, needing to ask, needing to anchor the reality of the intervention. Her eyes hardened, a flicker of genuine fear finally breaking through the wall of her indifference. "He is the peace. He is the quiet. He is the reason the city does not fall into the space between aisle 3 and aisle 5. You paid the toll, Elias. You bought your own way out. Do not insult the favor." She turned, her back straight and rigid, and used a separate, smaller key to open the employee door, disappearing into the cold, humming interior. I watched the door shut. I was free. I spent the rest of the day in a state of dissociative exhaustion. I tried to focus on my art, the single thing that had previously defined my world. I set up my easel, pulled out a clean canvas, and picked up a piece of charcoal. I intended to draw the light, the beautiful, ancient facade of the Bordeaux City Hall, the elegance of stone and iron. But my hand would not obey. When I finally lifted the charcoal from the page, the canvas was covered in lines that were sharp, recursive, and impossible. I had drawn the architecture of the depot, not the mundane shell, but the vectors of terror, a long, black suit with a perfectly featureless head placed at the mouth of a vortex. A twisting, narrow passageway paved with shapes that looked terribly like bones. The lines were not drawn. They were imposed, rigid lines of absolute horror that seemed to vibrate with their own internal frequency. The art was dead. It was no longer about interpretation or beauty. It was about compliance and containment. My worldview, once fluid and open, was now confined by the rules of the Nocturne Clauses. My freedom felt worse than the fear. It was a profound, suffocating emptiness. I had seen the true underlying nature of reality, the chaos, the things that hunger, the necessary sacrifices, and I couldn't unsee it. My life as an artist, as a student, was now a pale imitation of existence. The proprietor had warned me, "You are afraid of the wrong things." He hadn't meant the watcher. He meant life. At 11 p.m., I put on the one clean uniform shirt I hadn't discarded. I took the bus back to the depot, a silent, inevitable journey. I was no longer driven by desperation for money or by morbid curiosity. I was driven by belonging. I belonged to the depot now. It was the only place that made sense. The fog was beginning to settle again. The Nightside Depot looked heavy, waiting. I used my key, the key I should have returned but had kept, unconsciously, and unlocked the heavy steel door. The sickly yellow hum of the fluorescent lights greeted me like a familiar song. The air was cold, dry, and expectant. I went straight to the counter. The main journal was gone, replaced by a pristine, blank replacement. The proprietor's ritual kit, the pork, the potato, the water, was fully restocked in the hidden cabinet. I began my patrol. This time, I didn't run. I walked slowly, deliberately, down the long aisles. Aisle Zero was exactly where I remembered, the blank, cracked concrete wall. But this time, it was slightly different. The hairline fractures in the wall seemed to have multiplied, forming complex, interlocking glyphs that looked vaguely Mesopotamian. The wall wasn't a wall. It was a map of confinement. I didn't fear it. I studied it. I walked past the loading dock. The watcher was standing in his usual spot, the tear in the fabric of space. I didn't flinch. I did not avert my gaze completely, but neither did I stare. I looked directly at his torso, at the beautiful, impossible tailoring of the matte black suit, and felt a moment of deep, profound peace. I was no longer a victim. I was a colleague. At 4 a.m., the hour of the decaying man, I was waiting. He appeared, the man of wet parchment and agonizing need. He slid the tarnished franc across the counter, the same coin, perhaps, that he had used for decades. I slid the cigarette pack across. He seized it, smoking briefly in contact, and began to ripple away. "Wait," I said, my voice steady, professional, and cold. The decaying man paused his disintegration, his wet eyes focusing on me with a flicker of confusion. I opened the register, not to exchange money, but to take out my own personal notebook, a small, leather-bound volume I used for quick sketches and observational notes. I tore out a page, a small, charcoal sketch of the cathedral spire, drawn before the depot had tainted my vision, and placed it carefully on the counter, next to the space where the franc had been. It was a small, voluntary offering of my former self. The decaying man looked at the sketch, and for the first time, his face seemed to contort in something other than regret. It looked like sympathy. He slid his rippling hand across the counter and lightly tapped the sketch with a pale, moist fingertip. The paper instantly withered, losing all color, turning into a piece of ash that crumbled to the floor. The decaying man then completed his dissolution, leaving only the scent of decay. He had accepted the gift. My final task, the proprietor's nocturne plate. I walked into the break room at 4:30 a.m. I placed the plate on the table with the pork, potato, and water. I whispered the mandatory words, but I added a single, crucial word of my own, a word of terrible devotion. For the proprietor, for the stillness, and for my silence. I turned to leave, but the voice returned. Not the booming authority, but a gentle, resonant whisper, filled with a terrible satisfaction. "Welcome, Elias. You have chosen the only honest canvas." The sound of crushing bone began immediately. It was a rhythmic, peaceful sound this time, not a desperate one. I didn't run. I didn't flinch. I walked out, locked the break room door, and returned to the counter. When Margot arrived at 7 a.m., I was waiting. I had filed the blank journal, I had cleaned the counter, and I had already restocked the ritual supplies for the next night. She approached, and I offered her a slight, professional nod. "You're still here," she stated, not as a question, but as a dull observation. "The hours work well for my studies," I replied. Margot looked at me for a long time. She saw the absence of panic in my eyes, the cold, fixed certainty. She saw the truth. The depot had not